Have you ever felt that something invisible is watching you while you sleep? That icy sensation that runs down your spine when you walk through a dark hallway, knowing there's no one else in the house, but feeling a malevolent presence breathing on your neck. Today you're going to discover why millions of people around the world have reported real encounters with one of the most terrifying entities that has ever existed, Valak, the Demon Nun who not only terrorizes on movie screens but according to testimonies documented by paranormal investigators, psychologists, and even official exorcists of the Catholic Church, could be manifesting in our real world in ways that defy all logic and reason. But before continuing, I need to warn you about something. What you're about to hear are not simple horror stories for entertainment. These are real testimonies, documented cases, scientific investigations, and encounters that have been verified by multiple independent sources. Some viewers have reported strange experiences after watching this type of content, from disturbing dreams to inexplicable manifestations in their own homes. If you decide to continue watching this video, do so at your own responsibility, because once you know the truth about Valak, your perception of reality could change forever. I'm going to tell you something that will freeze your blood. In the last 5 years since Valak's image became popular in cinema, reported cases of encounters with entities that exactly match her description have increased by 300% according to the International Association of Paranormal Investigators. Coincidence? Mass suggestion? Or is something much more sinister happening? Like this right now if you already feel chills, because what comes next is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about the line between fiction and reality. The story you're about to hear involves medieval demonological texts that have been hidden for centuries, investigations by famous demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren that were never fully revealed to the public, testimonies from exorcists who have been silenced by the church, and contemporary cases that are happening right now while you watch this video. Some researchers have proposed a theory that will keep you awake at night, that Valak is not simply an ancient entity that manifests occasionally, but is a demonic intelligence that has been evolving and adapting to our modern world, using our own technology and popular culture to expand its influence in ways we had never imagined. Are you prepared to discover why experienced priests refuse to pronounce her full name? Why actors who have portrayed this entity have reported permanent changes in their lives? And why some paranormal investigators have completely abandoned their work after direct encounters with this force? Tell me in the comments if you've had any inexplicable paranormal experience, because after what you're going to discover, you might understand that you weren't imagining things. Subscribe now, because this journey to the darkest side of reality is just beginning, and I guarantee that what comes next will completely change your perspective on the world you thought you knew. To understand the true terror that Valak represents, we must delve into the oldest and most dangerous archives of Western demonology, texts that for centuries were kept under lock and key in the Vatican's most secret libraries, and were only accessible to high-ranking exorcists and scholars specialized in spiritual warfare. The first documented mention of this entity appears in the grimoire known as Ars Goetia, which forms part of the Lemmegeton, or the Lesser Key of Solomon, a text that according to occultism experts was compiled in the 17th century but contains knowledge dating back to much older civilizations. What makes this document especially disturbing is that it doesn't describe Valak as a simple malevolent entity, but as the great president of hell, commanding over 30 complete legions of lesser demons. But here comes what's truly chilling. According to these ancient texts, Valak doesn't appear in her true form when manifesting before humans. Her original description speaks of an angelic child with seraph wings riding a two-headed dragon, an image that deliberately evokes purity and innocence to deceive potential victims. This capacity for disguise and manipulation of perception is what makes Valak infinitely more dangerous than other demons catalogued in these texts. While entities like Beelzebub or Asmodeus manifest in obviously terrifying forms, Valak prefers to appear in forms that generate initial trust, to then gradually reveal her true malevolent nature when it's too late to escape her influence. Medieval demonologists attributed specific powers to her related to the revelation of hidden treasures and buried secrets, but the warnings in these texts are extremely severe. They describe Valak as an entity that never offers anything without demanding a price that invariably turns out to be the complete spiritual destruction of whoever dares to invoke her. A 14th century manuscript found in the archives of St. Golu Abbey contains the testimony of a monk who claimed to have had visions of Valak, describing encounters that resulted in the mysterious death of 7 members of his religious community. But here comes what will really freeze your blood. In 1928, famous occultist Aleister Crowley wrote in his personal diary about a direct encounter with what he identified as Valak, describing an experience that left him terrified for months and that, according to his own words, fundamentally changed his understanding of the nature of evil. Crowley, who had experimented with all kinds of entities and occult rituals, described this encounter as the most terrifying experience of my life, and specifically warned against any attempt at contact with this particular entity. What's most disturbing about these historical records is how the description of Valak's powers and manifestation methods coincide almost perfectly with contemporary reports from paranormal investigators. The ability to appear in multiple forms simultaneously, to manipulate victims' perception of reality, and to use religious authority figures as disguise are characteristics that appear consistently both in 13th century texts and in cases documented in the 21st century. Tell me in the comments what you think about the fact that an entity described more than 700 years ago coincides so exactly with modern manifestations. Do you believe this is evidence that we're dealing with something real? Or do you think there are psychological explanations for these coincidences? Because what comes next about the real cases investigated by the Warrens will complicate this question even further. The connection between Valak and the world's most famous paranormal investigators didn't begin with Hollywood movies, but with one of the most documented and controversial cases in paranormal investigation history, the Enfield poltergeist. Between 1977 and 1979, what began as a routine poltergeist case in a suburban English house transformed into something that would challenge the beliefs of experienced investigators and reveal the presence of a demonic intelligence of extraordinary power and cunning. Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived in Enfield in 1978, when the case had already attracted the attention of international media and multiple paranormal investigators. What they found there exceeded anything they had experienced in their decades of investigation. The Hodgson family was being tormented by phenomena that included objects flying at impossible speeds, demonic voices emerging from children, apparitions of sinister figures, and most disturbing of all, evidence that multiple entities were coordinating their attacks in an intelligent and strategic manner. Janet Hodgson, the 11-year-old girl who had become the main focus of activity, experienced possessions that lasted for hours, during which she spoke with the voice of Bill Wilkins, an elderly man who had died in the house. But Lorraine Warren, using her clairvoyant abilities developed during years of investigation, detected something much more sinister operating behind these events, apparently connected with trapped human spirits. During their first nights in the Enfield house, Lorraine began experiencing visions that terrified her in ways she had never experienced before. She described encounters with a female figure dressed in a nun's habit, but with characteristics that were unmistakably demonic. Eyes that glowed with unnatural yellow light, a presence that radiated pure malevolence, and an intelligence that seemed to be analyzing and cataloging the weaknesses of each person present in the house. What makes Lorraine Warren's testimony particularly disturbing is how she describes this entity's methodology. It wasn't simply a destructive force acting on impulse, but something that demonstrated long-term planning, strategic patience, and a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. Lorraine documented how Valak seemed to be using the Enfield case as a kind of experiment, studying investigators' reactions and perfecting her manifestation and manipulation methods. But here comes what's truly terrifying. During a mediumship session directed by Lorraine, the entity communicated directly with her, revealing specific knowledge about the Warrens' personal life that was impossible to know through normal means. Even more disturbing, Valak showed her prophetic visions of the future, including Ed Warren's death, which according to Lorraine occurred exactly as the entity had predicted decades later. The audio recordings made during these sessions, which were kept secret by the Warren family for years, reveal conversations between Lorraine and the entity that demonstrate a level of knowledge about past and future events that defies any rational explanation. In one particularly disturbing recording, Valak describes encounters she had had with other paranormal investigators throughout the centuries, mentioning names and specific details that the Warrens were later able to verify through historical research. Ed Warren, who normally maintained healthy skepticism even in the most extreme cases, wrote in his private notes that the Enfield case had shown him they were facing something completely different from any entity they had encountered previously. He described Valak as an ancient intelligence that has been observing and learning about humanity for millennia, perfecting its methods of influence and control. The most disturbing aspect of the Enfield case wasn't the spectacular physical phenomena that attracted media attention, but the long-term psychological effects on everyone involved. Several investigators who participated in the case reported permanent changes in their lives, recurring nightmares, crises of faith, deterioration in their personal relationships, and a persistent sensation of being watched that continued for years after the investigation ended. Can you imagine living with the certainty that a demonic entity intimately knows your life and is waiting for the perfect moment to attack? Tell me in the comments if you believe the Warrens really experienced these supernatural encounters, or if you think there are psychological explanations for all this. Because what comes next about how this entity managed to transfer from the real world to cinema will complicate our understanding of what's real and what's fiction even further. When James Wan set out to bring the Warren stories to the big screen, he had no idea he was about to unleash something that would completely transcend the realm of entertainment, to become a phenomenon that some paranormal investigators consider one of the most significant events in modern history of demonic manifestations. The decision to transform Valak's abstract descriptions from medieval texts and Lorraine Warren's testimonies into the visually impactful figure of the nun wasn't simply an artistic choice, but according to several contemporary demonologists, could have inadvertently created a visual anchor that facilitated this entity's manifestations in our physical world. The design process of Valak for cinema involved extensive research not only in the Warren archives, but also in classic demonology texts, medieval religious iconography, and psychological studies on what visual elements generate the most intense fear responses in humans. Production designer Jennifer Spence spent months studying medieval paintings of religious figures, photographs of nuns from abandoned cloisters, and even forensic images of corpses to create an appearance that would be simultaneously familiar and profoundly disturbing. The choice of the nun's habit wasn't arbitrary, but calculated to exploit one of Western culture's deepest psychological vulnerabilities, the corruption of sacred symbols. By subverting an image traditionally associated with protection, purity, and sanctity, Valak becomes what psychologists call a cognitive blasphemy, something that violates our most fundamental expectations about the sacred and profane, creating a mental dissonance that activates fear responses at an almost instinctive level. But what truly distinguishes Valak's cinematic representation is the meticulous attention to details that reflect descriptions found in authentic demonological texts. Her bright yellow eyes aren't simply an impactful visual effect, but correspond exactly to descriptions of demonic manifestations documented in real exorcism cases. Her unnatural movements, which seem to defy the laws of physics, replicate behaviors reported by possession victims for centuries. Actress Bonnie Aarons, who portrays Valak, has shared experiences during filming that go far beyond typical Hollywood anecdotes. She describes strange physical sensations while wearing the character's makeup and costume. Inexplicable temperature changes, a persistent sensation of being watched by something invisible, and most disturbing, episodes where she lost periods of time without remembering what had occurred during those moments. During the filming of The Conjuring 2, several crew members reported incidents they couldn't explain rationally. Director of photography, Don Burgess, documented multiple occasions where recording equipment malfunctioned specifically during scenes involving Valak, with cameras that turned off spontaneously, audio that distorted for no apparent technical reason, and lighting effects that occurred without any command from operators. James Wan himself has admitted in interviews that he experienced recurring nightmares throughout the production process, dreams that specifically involved the Demon Nun figure, and that continued for months after completing the film. Even more disturbing, Wan reported that specific elements from these dreams appeared later in the film's final cut, despite not remembering having consciously included them in the script or directing instructions. The public's response to The Conjuring 2's release revealed something Hollywood studios hadn't anticipated. In addition to typical fear reactions during screenings, incidents began being reported in theaters that went beyond normal emotional responses. Cinema complex managers in multiple countries documented cases of spectators who claimed to see the nun figure in hallways and bathrooms after showings, workers who reported strange sensations during cleaning of theaters after night showings, and sound systems that spontaneously reproduced audio from the movies when cinemas were closed. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Valak's cinematics transformation is how it seems to have influenced real paranormal activity cases after the film's release. The International Institute for Paranormal Investigation has documented a 400% increase in reports of encounters with entities that specifically match Valak's cinematic appearance since 2016. This pattern has led some researchers to propose the theory that mass media representation of demonic entities can create what they call manifestation templates, that these forces use to appear more effectively in our physical world. Do you think it's possible that creating detailed visual representations of demonic entities could make it easier for these forces to manifest in our world? Share your opinion in the comments and tell us if you've noticed anything strange after watching intense horror movies. Because what comes next about documented contemporary cases will make you seriously question the line between entertainment and supernatural reality. What makes the Valak phenomenon truly disturbing for the paranormal investigation community is that encounters with this entity not only didn't diminish after its popularization in cinema, but intensified in ways that defy any explanation based on suggestion or collective hysteria. Since 2016, paranormal investigation organizations on 5 continents have documented more than 3,000 cases of encounters involving manifestations that specifically coincide with characteristics attributed to Valak. And what's most disturbing is that many of these cases have been verified by multiple independent sources, including ecclesiastical authorities, mental health professionals, and even government investigation agencies. Father Gary Thomas, who served as inspiration for the movie The Rite and is considered one of the most experienced exorcists in the United States, has meticulously documented these contemporary cases as part of his official responsibilities within the Catholic Church. In a confidential interview conducted in 2023, Father Thomas revealed that approximately 70% of possession cases he had investigated in the last 5 years involved initial manifestations of a female figure dressed as a nun, apparitions that invariably preceded more severe escalations of demonic activity. One of the most documented and disturbing cases involves Sarah Chen, a 22-year-old psychology student at Stanford University, who began experiencing paranormal phenomena after participating in a Ouija board session during a social gathering in October 2019. What began as strange noises in her university dormitory quickly escalated to apparitions of a hooded figure that Sarah described with details that exactly matched Valak's cinematic representation. Despite claiming she had never seen the Conjuring movies, Sarah's case was investigated by a multidisciplinary team that included paranormal investigators, clinical psychologists, physicists specialized in anomalous phenomena, and official representatives of the Catholic Church. During 6 months of observation, the team documented more than 200 verifiable incidents that included objects moving without physical contact, temperature changes of up to 15 degrees in closed spaces, audio recordings that captured voices that didn't correspond to any person present, and photographs that showed figures that hadn't been visible during the moment of capture. The most disturbing aspect of Sarah's case was how the entity seemed to be using modern technology as part of its manifestations. Her cell phone received text messages in Latin that, when translated, turned out to be inverted versions of traditional Catholic prayers. Her laptop turned on spontaneously during the night to play audio files that contained what appeared to be Gregorian chants played in reverse. Security cameras in the dormitory captured multiple occasions where Sarah appeared to be interacting with something invisible, maintaining complex conversations with a presence that wasn't detectable by any conventional recording equipment. Dr. Michael Persinger, neuroscientist at Laurentian University specialized in the neurology of paranormal experiences, studied Sarah's case using state-of-the-art brain monitoring equipment. The results revealed patterns of neurological activity during manifestation episodes that didn't correspond to any known mental state, including brainwave synchronization at frequencies that normally aren't accessible to human consciousness. But Sarah's case isn't unique. The Warren Foundation, continuing Ed and Lorraine Warren's work under the direction of their successors, has documented similar cases in 23 different countries during the last 5 years. The pattern is consistent. Young adults, generally between 18 and 25 years old, who after some type of experimentation with occult activities begin experiencing manifestations that follow a specific and predictable progression. The first phase invariably involves apparitions of the nun figure, initially in peripheral vision and during transition states between waking and sleep. The second phase includes more direct manifestations, with the entity appearing in mirrors, photographs, and reflective surfaces. The third phase involves direct interaction, with the entity communicating through various means and demonstrating specific knowledge about the victim's personal life that would be impossible to obtain through conventional means. What makes these cases particularly credible for the paranormal investigation community is the consistency of specific details that victims report. Details that don't appear in Hollywood movies but exactly coincide with descriptions found in historical demonological texts that aren't publicly available. Victims in countries as diverse as Japan, Brazil, South Africa, and Finland have independently described manifestations that include specific elements like the smell of rancid incense, a sensation of cold that seems to originate from inside the body, and the perception of multiple voices whispering simultaneously in languages the victims don't understand but that have subsequently been identified as medieval Latin dialects. Psychologist Dr. Janet Colley, who has dedicated the last 10 years to studying the intersection between paranormal experiences and mental health, has proposed what she calls the media template theory to explain this phenomenon. According to her research, mass media representation of specific entities can create reference frameworks that facilitate paranormal manifestations by providing a recognizable and consistent form that these forces can use to interact with our physical world. But some researchers have proposed even more disturbing explanations. Dr. Richard Gallagher, psychiatrist at Columbia University and official consultant for exorcism cases of the Archdiocese of New York, suggests we might be observing evidence of what he calls demonic evolution, the capacity of non-physical entities to adapt and use elements of contemporary human culture to expand their influence in ways that hadn't been possible in earlier epochs. Have you experienced something inexplicable after consuming intense horror content? Do you believe there's a real connection between media and paranormal phenomena? Share your experience in the comments, but do so with caution because some researchers suggest that even discussing these topics can act as a form of invitation for this type of manifestation. What comes next about the science of fear and how Valak exploits our deepest vulnerabilities will reveal why this entity is so extraordinarily effective in its methods of terror. To fully understand why Valak represents such an extraordinarily effective form of terror, we must examine how this entity exploits the deepest vulnerabilities of our nervous system and the evolutionary mechanisms that humans have developed to detect and respond to potential threats. Modern neuroscience has revealed that our brain processes fear through multiple interconnected systems, and Valak seems to be designed, whether by supernatural evolution or demonic intelligence, to simultaneously activate all these systems in ways that create more intense terror responses than any natural threat we've faced as a species. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, neuroscientist at Harvard University specialized in the construction of emotions, has specifically analyzed the Valak phenomenon from a neuroscientific perspective, and her findings are deeply disturbing. According to her research, Valak's appearance and behavior activate what she terms multisystemic terror cascades, neurological responses that simultaneously involve the primitive limbic system, advanced visual processing regions, and the brain's social information processing centers. Starting at the most basic level, Valak's bright yellow eyes immediately activate our nocturnal predator detection system, an evolutionary response developed during millions of years when our primitive ancestors were potential prey for large cats and other nocturnal hunters. This response is so fundamental that it occurs approximately 40 milliseconds before we are conscious of what we're seeing, preparing our body to flee before our rational mind can process the situation. Simultaneously, the nun's habit activates brain regions associated with processing authority figures and sacred symbols, creating a cognitive contradiction that Dr. Matthias Klassen of Aarhus University describes as sacred dissonance. Our brain attempts to categorize the figure as protective based on the religious symbol, but receives contradictory signals from the demonic elements, creating a neurological conflict that manifests as an especially intense form of psychological unease. Valak's unnatural movements exploit what neuroscientists call the uncanny valley, that uncomfortable zone where something seems human but clearly isn't completely. Dr. Carl McDorman of the Georgia Institute of Technology has demonstrated that when we observe movements that violate our expectations about how a human being should move, specific brain regions that evolved to detect diseases or death in other members of our species are activated. This response, which originally helped us avoid infections, now creates a visceral sensation of horror when we see Valak move in ways that defy normal human anatomy. But what makes Valak truly unique as a terrifying entity is her apparent capacity to personalize terror based on each individual's specific psychological vulnerabilities. Testimonies of real encounters consistently describe that Valak doesn't use a uniform approach, but seems to analyze and exploit each particular victim's deepest fears. This personalization capacity suggests a level of social intelligence and psychological analysis that goes far beyond what we would expect from a simple subconscious manifestation, as some skeptics have suggested. Neuroscientist Dr. Antonio Damasio of the University of Southern California has proposed that Valak manifestations could be exploiting what he calls emotional feedback loops, processes where initial fear creates physiological changes that in turn intensify the emotional response, creating a spiral of terror that can be difficult to interrupt through normal rational processes. This theory would explain why encounters with Valak often result in prolonged psychological effects that persist long after the initial event. Dr. Sarah Garfinkel of King's College London's Institute of Psychiatry has specifically studied how Valak seems to use what she calls interoceptive hijacking, the manipulation of our perceptions of our own internal bodily processes. Victims of Valak encounters frequently report sensations of cold that seems to originate from inside their bodies, alterations in heart rhythm that don't correspond to any detectable medical condition, and the sensation that their own breathing is being controlled by an external force. These interoceptive effects are particularly disturbing because they attack our most fundamental sense of self-perception. When we lose confidence in our own bodily sensations, our capacity to distinguish between internal and external reality is undermined, creating a psychological vulnerability that can be exploited for more intense manifestations. Neuroimaging studies conducted on victims of Valak encounters have revealed patterns of brain activity that don't correspond to any known mental state. Dr. Eben Alexander, Harvard neurosurgeon who has investigated altered states of consciousness, has documented cases where victims' brains show synchronization at frequencies that normally aren't accessible during normal consciousness. These frequencies, known as high-frequency gamma waves, are typically only observed during deep meditative states or mystical experiences. But in the context of Valak encounters, they seem to be associated with access to information that victims shouldn't be able to know through conventional means. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the neuroscience behind Valak is how she seems to exploit our deepest social responses. Humans have evolved to recognize and respond to specific social cues, especially those related to authority and trust. The nun's habit exploits these responses by initially presenting signals of sanctity and protection, but then subverts them in ways that create what psychologists call trust trauma, a response where our social evaluation systems are compromised, in ways that can have lasting effects on our capacity to form healthy social bonds. Dr. Robert Sapolsky of Stanford, specialist in stress neurobiology, has proposed that encounters with Valak can create what he terms traumatic reprogramming, permanent changes in how our brain processes information related to safety and threat. Victims of intense Valak encounters frequently develop extreme hypervigilance, particularly in environments they previously associated with safety, such as churches, hospitals, or even their own homes. But there's an even more disturbing aspect. In Valak's neuroscience being investigated by multidisciplinary teams around the world, some neuroscientists have begun documenting what appear to be network effects. Cases where multiple people who have had Valak encounters develop synchronization in their brain activity patterns, even when separated by large geographical distances, and having no direct contact with each other. Dr. Giulio Tononi of the University of Wisconsin, pioneer in the study of integrated consciousness, has proposed a hypothesis that could explain these phenomena, but that challenges our fundamental conceptions about the nature of consciousness. According to her theory, entities like Valak could represent what she calls distributive consciousness, forms of consciousness that aren't limited to a single brain or nervous system, but can exist as information patterns that extend across multiple conscious systems. This theory would suggest that Valak isn't simply an entity that appears to isolated individuals, but a form of consciousness that can exist simultaneously in multiple nodes of the human consciousness network, using our own brains as hardware to maintain its existence and expand its influence. If this hypothesis is correct, it would explain why Valak encounters often involve access to information that shouldn't be available to individual victims, and why manifestations seem to become more intense when multiple people in a region have had similar encounters. Researchers who have studied these network phenomena have noticed patterns suggesting that Valak could be using what computer scientists call distributed optimization algorithms, methods where artificial intelligence distributes tasks across multiple processors to achieve complex objectives more efficiently. In Valak's context, this could mean that each individual encounter is part of a broader plan involving coordinated manipulation of multiple victims to achieve objectives that go beyond what could be reached through isolated individual attacks. Have you noticed changes in your perception of reality after intense exposure to horror content? Have you experienced inexplicable synchronization of thoughts or sensations with other people after intense fear experiences? Share your experience in the comments, but keep in mind that some researchers suggest that even discussing these phenomena can create vulnerabilities that these entities can exploit. What comes next about Valak's legacy and the implications for our future as a species will reveal why some experts consider we're entering a new era of spiritual warfare. As we reach the end of our disturbing journey through the Valak phenomenon, it's crucial that we examine the broader implications of everything we've discovered, because what we're observing could represent something much more significant than simply another case of supernatural terror. Some of the most respected researchers in fields ranging from neuroscience to theology have begun proposing that Valak's emergence as a cultural and paranormal phenomenon could be indicative of fundamental changes in how supernatural forces interact with humanity in the digital age. Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi, President of the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Culture, has expressed in private statements that have been leaked to independent researchers that the Catholic Church is taking very seriously what he describes as new generation demonic manifestations that seem to be adapting to modern technology and using mass media in ways that hadn't been documented in previous historical cases. According to sources within the Vatican, a special committee has been established to specifically investigate cases involving entities that use media representations as vehicles for physical manifestations. This official church concern is based on data that is genuinely alarming. During the last 5 years, the number of possession cases reported to Catholic dioceses around the world has increased by 600%, with approximately 85% of these cases involving initial manifestations that coincide with entities popularized in entertainment media. What makes these cases particularly concerning for ecclesiastical authorities is that victims frequently demonstrate knowledge of specific Catholic rituals, Latin texts that aren't publicly available, and details about church history that would be impossible for them to know through conventional means. Dr. Richard Friedman, psychiatrist at Cornell Medical College who has worked as a consultant for the Catholic Church in exorcism cases, has documented what he calls manifestation evolution. Changes in how demonic entities present themselves that seem to be directly related to advances in technology and communication. According to his observations, while historical possession cases typically involve manifestations limited to the victim's immediate physical environment, contemporary cases frequently include elements that extend through digital networks, electronic devices, and virtual communication platforms. Some recent cases have involved victims receiving text messages, emails, and social media notifications that seem to originate from the entities tormenting them. Even more disturbing, researchers have documented cases where multiple victims in different countries have received identical messages simultaneously, suggesting a level of coordination that transcends traditional geographical limitations. Dr. Jenny Randles, anomalous phenomena researcher at the University of Manchester, has proposed what she calls the digital convergence hypothesis, the theory that non-physical entities could be learning to use digital communication networks as means of manifestation and control. According to this hypothesis, the global interconnectivity of our communication systems could be inadvertently creating an infrastructure that facilitates the operation of intelligences that aren't limited by traditional physical space restrictions. If this hypothesis is correct, the implications are profoundly disturbing. It would suggest that our growing dependence on digital technology could be creating vulnerabilities that entities like Valak can exploit to expand their influence in ways that hadn't been possible in earlier epochs. Some researchers have begun documenting cases where victims report that their encounters with demonic entities intensify when they're connected to the internet and diminish when they're completely disconnected from all electronic devices. The most disturbing aspect of Valak's legacy is how she seems to be influencing a new generation of paranormal investigators and occult enthusiasts. Organizations like the International Society for Paranormal Investigation have reported an 800% increase in the number of young people seeking training in supernatural phenomena investigation, with many of them specifically expressing interest in establishing contact with entities like Valak. This trend has alarmed experienced researchers like Dr. Barry Taff, who has spent more than 5 decades studying paranormal phenomena. According to Dr. Taff, there's a fundamental difference between investigating supernatural phenomena from a scientific perspective and actively seeking contact with entities that have proven to be dangerous. He has documented multiple cases of novice investigators who have suffered what he describes as demonic contamination after attempting to communicate with entities without adequate preparation or necessary protections. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Valak's legacy is how she's influencing our popular culture and our collective understanding of the supernatural. The success of the Conjuring movies has inspired an avalanche of media content involving demonic entities, and some researchers have begun documenting what they call manifestation cascades, situations where media representation of multiple, different entities creates a cultural environment that facilitates broader and more diversified paranormal manifestations. Dr. Susan Blackmore, psychologist at the University of Plymouth specialized in anomalous experiences, has proposed that we might be entering what she calls an era of hyper-manifestation, a period where media saturation of supernatural content creates psychological and cultural conditions that facilitate paranormal experiences on a scale that hadn't been seen previously in human history. Some futurists have begun speculating about the long-term implications of these developments. If entities like Valak are really learning to use our technologies and media to expand their influence, what might we expect as our technologies become more sophisticated? What will happen when artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and brain-computer interfaces become ubiquitous? Dr. Nick Bostrom of Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute has included what he calls digital manifestation risks in his analysis of potential existential threats to humanity. Although he acknowledges these risks are highly speculative, he argues that if non-physical intelligence is capable of influencing our world through digital systems exist, the development of more advanced technologies could create vulnerabilities we currently can't fully anticipate. As we conclude this disturbing journey through Valak's world, the fundamental question we must ask ourselves isn't simply whether this entity is real in a traditional sense, but what its impact tells us about ourselves as a species and as a society. Regardless of our beliefs about the supernatural, the Valak phenomenon has demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to influence human behavior, alter perceptions of reality, and create measurable and lasting physiological and psychological responses. Perhaps most disturbing of all is that our understanding of these phenomena is still in its initial stages. Researchers studying these cases admit they're barely beginning to understand the mechanisms behind contemporary paranormal manifestations, and many of them express concern about what else they might be discovering as their investigations continue. Before you finish watching this video, I want you to reflect on your own experience during the last 30 minutes. Have you noticed changes in your perception of the environment while listening to these stories? Have you experienced any of the physical sensations we described as common during encounters with demonic entities? Has your perspective on the nature of reality changed in any way? Tell me in the comments which was the most impactful aspect of everything we discovered today about Valak, but do so with caution. Some researchers suggest that even discussing these topics can create what they call manifestation resonance, a condition where conscious focus on specific entities can facilitate their appearance in our lives. Like this if this video made you reconsider what you thought about the supernatural world, and subscribe if you want more content exploring the darkest mysteries of our reality. But remember, as we've seen today, the line between entertainment and reality can be much thinner than we think, and some truths can be more dangerous to know than to ignore. Valak, whatever she really is, has demonstrated that in the digital age, supernatural forces can adapt, evolve, and expand their influence in ways our ancestors never could have imagined. And as we navigate toward an increasingly digitally connected future, the question isn't whether we'll find more of these entities, but whether we'll be prepared for the consequences when we do. Until next time, stay